So we kick off our workshop with the results of a systematic literature review that a group of us here in Manchester have been working on. You'll all be aware of China's increasing presence in the global south, official foreign aid in the range of 3 to 7 billions of US dollars per year, depending on your definition, cumulative total in the hundreds of billions of dollars for all Belt and Road initiatives. Alongside this, rapid growth of China's own digital economy, worth between 8 and 40% of China's GDP, depending on breadth of definition. Huawei, China Mobile, Alibaba, Tencent, all turning over more than $50 billion per year. China hosting 7 of the world's 20 largest internet companies. And so if we put these two things around international presence in the South and digital together, we have the Digital Silk Road projects, some of which are shown there on the slide, reflecting a pivot towards digital within the Belt and Road Initiative, particularly in the wake of COVID. And a much bigger, more general presence. I'm sure many of you know the statistics: 70% of Africa's 4G infrastructure, 50% of all of Africa's smartphones, in pole position for 5G across the global south, and so on. And that perhaps in part reflecting a pivot from global north to global south in the wake of the challenges for some Chinese big tech in some global north markets. However, with plenty of comment that digital has been relatively ignored in research on China's going out in the global south, we decided to undertake a systematic literature review. That consisted of a major search last summer, an update this month, and outreach to a set of scholars for recommendations of key texts. And from an initial set of around 241 items, this has now been whittled down to a corpus of 75 that make up the review. Half of them journal papers, the rest institutional publications and book chapters. So, some key points of note from the profile of the material. First of all, there's a bimodal distribution in terms of author location, dominated by those in the US and China. And despite items being selected only when they had a focus on the global south, only a small minority of lead authors were actually south-based, as you can see, for example, as many lead authors in Australia as there were in the whole of Africa. In terms of the academic locations of authors and publication outlets, 4 disciplines dominate: international studies broadly defined, area and regional studies, business and management, and communication and media studies. Notable to our group conducting the review, given the majority of us are in the university's Global Development Institute and would see development studies as a natural home for analysing what's going on in the global south, there was a very limited presence for our home discipline. Debatable how much of a concern that is, but more of an issue might be academic and analytical depth. Just 4, so only around 5% of the papers involved systematic application of a theory or even a conceptual framework. Doesn't mean it wasn't good work, but it did fall short on certain criteria, therefore, of academic rigor. That probably also linked to a great preponderance of publication based on secondary data. And even those relatively few papers that undertook interviews leaned towards interviews with Chinese sources, and that boiled down to only 4 papers, again around 5%, that drew the majority of their primary evidence from global south sources. So that leads to the first of 6 elements for a future research agenda that I'm going to present today, which can be summed up as a need for more southern voices, more researchers from and based in the global south, much greater emphasis on original empirical research undertaken in the south, and within that empirical research, a much greater space for stakeholders from the global south to be heard. So the government policymakers seeking to regulate digital, the officials who are signing deals, those who are working for Chinese digital companies in their home countries, local digital firms that are competing with Chinese digital companies, those who are consuming Chinese digital goods and services. Strongly but not solely linked to that bimodal distribution of authors, the worldview of papers was also somewhat bimodally distributed, with a group of what Wen calls celebratory accounts, rose-tinted, uncritical descriptions of the positive role of Chinese firms and the Chinese state in developing countries, and then conversely a set of work largely from US political think tanks that see China's digital expansion as solely malign. That's most readily illustrated in the literature on digital surveillance. From the sinophilic side, literature on the benefits of living in safe cities with claims of reductions in crime. From the sinophobic side, the claim that China's using digital tech as a tool of sharp power and exporting a digital authoritarianism that threatens rights and freedoms across the global south. Both of those views, I think, tending to towards what I would call sino-exceptionalism, seeing China as particular and different to other countries for either better or worse. Critiquing those positions, particularly the sinophobic literature, are papers arguing that the West is very similar to China in many of its digital strategies and actions in the global south. And again, if we took the example of surveillance, the fact that North American and European companies are significant exporters of surveillance systems, including those used to spy on political opponents. So if we're thinking about future research, that may seek to hit the sweet spot between exceptionalism and identicalism. So in surveillance, for example, recognizing the role of all suppliers and problems linked to many different systems, but also that Chinese suppliers are dominant and that they may differ in terms of their role and proximity to the state. And we could also argue a similar sweet spot approach for other topics. For example, China's digital aid strategy that is characterized on the one hand as very different from that of Western agencies, but actually which on the other quite closely resembles Western tied aid strategies that were dominant a few decades back and which are seeing a partial resurgence at the moment. Or we could see the sweet spot in relation to business strategies. For example, what are the realities behind Alibaba's inclusive globalization? Is this actually something different that can promote the interests of small enterprises in the global south? Or, as recent work by Maxi and others suggests, is this actually a business-led free trade small state approach to development that's entirely congruent with the tenets of neoliberal globalization and with e-commerce platforms being Trojan horses that enable Chinese imports to drive local small businesses out of business? The focus for China's digital expansion has changed over time, beginning back in the 1990s with telecom infrastructure, then adding devices in the 2000s, then adding web services and platforms on top of that from the 2010s, and some limited direct moves into supporting local, i.e. local institutions within developing countries, institutions of digital governance. Research always lags practice, of course, so work on telecom infrastructure dominates the literature to date, and therefore that leaves a set of more recent activities so far empirically under-researched. The technologies and the institutions at the top and the bottom of the stack. Emerging technologies not explicitly represented here, so AI, Internet of Things, autonomous vehicles. Something not exported, but the essential and foundational component of the whole stack, data. And I think for those of us working in the field of digital development, questions of whether China's growing involvement in ICT for development applications will look different from that of existing ICT for D actors, for example, around core guiding principles like the principles for digital development or around ideas of South-South cooperative digital design. A stereotype found in some of the literature is the notion of Team China Digital, that there is this homogeneous entity in which all actors are working together towards a well-defined common goal. Of course, there is evidence of the way in which the state loans support digital exports, or of suppliers in different parts of the tech stack working together. And evidence of conflict and dissonance in activities overseas tends to only occasionally leak through the cracks, though of course at home, state restraints on China big tech that began last year have been quite widely publicized. But inside evidence about the relationships shown in this diagram, yeah, evidence is largely speculative to date, and it needs investigation. For sure, there's a research agenda challenging the notion of a digital Cold War, for example, examining the relatively unspotlit collaborations in the global south between Chinese and Western digital firms, even between state actors. But if we look at policies and norms around internet governance and data governance and digital trade being promoted by Chinese as opposed to Western states, there are clear differences along dimensions of market versus state, civil society versus state, the simplistic formulation of freedom versus sovereignty, and there's definitely political maneuvering and assertive bordering on aggressive defense of those differing standpoints, sitting alongside commercial competition with claims and counterclaims about the sources of Chinese competitiveness in global South markets. Literature today indicates that the Chinese position on all these matters tends to resonate better with developing country officials than does the US or Western position. But very largely, the characterization of developing country actors is neo-colonial, marginalizing, sometimes disrespectful or ignorant. Developing country actors are ciphers or pawns in the great game between the US and China, or the global south is a terra nullius, an empty landscape on which the game is played out. I pulled out a couple of quotes here. One source talks about developing countries where digital connectivity is essentially absent, and another one of underdeveloped states that are in the pre-STEAM era. So because of all of this, new research is needed to put local actors and agency center stage, understanding that procurement of Chinese tech is often as much or more demand pull than supply push. Analyzing the role of local officials in negotiating deals, for example, the extent of their ability to play off and select between Western and Chinese actors. Analyzing the role in US-China tensions of developing country members within international forums, from the ITU to ICANN to the Internet Governance Forum, and researching the role and strategy of local digital companies when Chinese big tech rolls into town. As a final theme, what about the development impact of China's digital expansion? There's a lot of hypothesizing and speculation here. Positive speculation about the contribution to economic growth and other sustainable development goals, negative speculation about increasing insecurity, about control and digital and financial dependency, and about increasing inequality. Balanced and empirical evaluation is needed at two levels. At the meso level of cost-benefit evaluation of individual systems to understand the socioeconomic impact of data centers and e-commerce platforms and smart city systems and the more, and at the more immanent or structural macro level to understand the broader implications of engagement with Chinese state and private digital actors, especially political and geopolitical and macro financial impacts around contested issues like realignments in local polities, local labor markets, local technological capabilities, debt, and the like. From these should come some policy and practice lessons for global South countries. For example, how best to maximize the benefits and minimize the risks of interaction with China's digital expansion, local participation in digital design and implementation, localization of digital skills and control and value, national policies on digital governance, etc. Overall, how to get warmth, not burned from the dragon. So that's given us some key themes That's by no means the entirety of what's emerging from our systematic literature review. And of course, we also anticipate deriving some ideas from all of you in our discussions during the day. We believe that the papers being summarized today will make a small contribution towards fulfilling the emerging agenda, as will publication of papers from these presentations, and hopefully other publications will be emerging from you, the participants, as well, to address this emerging agenda, because there is a great deal of work to be done. And we'd aim for those of us participating today who are going to be actively researching this topic to form some kind of at least informal network to continue sharing ideas and collaborating in some way. Thank you. And with apologies, I should have introduced Nick, who is chairing this session. So over to you, Nick.
Thanks very much, Richard. And thank you for that talk. Richard's been very efficient with his talk, so we have a couple more minutes for questions. We have about 10 to 12 minutes. So if you want to either put your hand up on the Zoom, or you can put something in the chat. Richard, do you want to take sort of 2 or 3 at a time, or do you want to
start by sharing my screen? Can you see my slides? Okay, great. And can you hear me fine? Because I know that there are some internet issues. Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Tin Al-Kadi. I'm a PhD candidate in international development at the London School of Economics. And the paper I'm presenting today is titled Learning Along the Digital Silk Road, Technology Transfer, Power, and Chinese ICT Corporations in North Africa. This is part of my broader PhD project looking at the developmental implications of China's digital presence in North Africa. So the presentation is going to be structured as follows. I'm going to start with a short introduction before discussing the literature and the theoretical framework used in this paper. I will then briefly discuss the methodology used in the paper, and then I will move on to findings and analysis before concluding with some policy recommendations, and then we'll move to the Q&A. This is very much work in progress, so all questions, comments, suggestions are very much welcome. Introduction. So over 2,200 years ago, the ancient Silk Road played an important role in diffusing Chinese inventions and technologies to Eurasia, Europe, and the rest of the world. And in the 21st century, China's Belt and Road Initiative, and most importantly, its digital component, the Digital Silk Road, can play an important role in diffusing Chinese technology to the rest of the world. However, as Richard was mentioning just now, the debate is very much dominated by what does China's rise mean for the US's hegemony over the cyberspace. It's a very US-centric debate. And we don't know yet what China's digital presence means for technological catch-up in other developing countries, right? So this paper is trying to contribute to this literature. And the central research questions I'm asking here is, do Chinese tech giants create new opportunities for technology transfer, learning, and innovation, or conversely, hinder the building up of domestic technological capabilities in host middle-income countries? So the literature recognizes 2 main mechanisms for that, horizontal and vertical spillovers. So horizontal spillovers mainly occur through labor mobility. So this is when someone who's working for a foreign multinational goes and works for a local firm within the same industry, or sets up his own venture within the same industry, right? So the theory is that through labor mobility, this person will take the advanced skills and technological and managerial knowledge grasped at the foreign multinational. Vertical spillovers happen through backward and forward linkages. And the idea is that the foreign multinational through interacting with local suppliers, customers, and subcontractors, will create demonstration effects and also provide training to these firms. And this will ultimately help them upgrade their processes and catch up. So spillovers can help local industries build up their domestic technological capabilities and catch up with the technological frontier. There is a nascent literature on Chinese digital firms and technology transfer, looking at the role played by Chinese digital multinationals, mainly original equipment manufacturers, so OEMs like Huawei and ZTE in Africa. And this literature brings very valuable insights to this. So Agribi's work, for instance, looks at Huawei's presence in Nigeria, and she argues that Huawei, through training employees, students, subcontractors, and so on, contributes to technology transfer and to upgrading local human capabilities. However, the problem with this literature is that it tends to adopt what I call a rather simple diffusionist model of technology transfer, which basically just measures the existence or absence of these linkages, of backward and forward linkages. And I argue that this framework conceals the norms, standards, and deeper politics conveyed in transfer technologies and training programs. And I argue that analyzing technology spillovers requires observing not just their occurrence through backward and forward linkages, but also scrutinizing what these linkages actually do on the ground and the deeper effects they produce on the ground. So to try and unpack the hidden political work of technological artifacts and infrastructure, I rely on the techno-politics framework. So in its basic form, techno-politics refers to the strategic practice of designing and using technology to constitute, embody, or enact political goals. And what I try to do through this paper is to basically bring together insights from structural economic development to like trace the occurrence of backward and forward linkages, and also horizontal spillovers, but also using technopolitics to understand the politics conveyed through these channels and the deeper effect technology transfer may have. So through this framework, we stopped seeing technology transfer and training, for instance, as this depoliticized programs, but try and understand the deeper effects on the ground. So to answer this question, the empirical setting for this paper is in North Africa. So actually one of the first references of the digital Silk Road came in the 13th five-year plan published by the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China, and it highlights the intention to develop an online road with countries and others. In recent years, there's been an important influx of Chinese digital capital in the region. One of the most important projects of the digital Silk Road is actually the strategically named Peace Cable, the Pakistan East Africa Cable Express, which connects first China to Pakistan, but then Pakistan to Europe through Egypt and the Suez Canal. In recent years, as North African economies are trying to shift towards build digital economies, Huawei and ZTE have gained more markets in North Africa. They played an important role in the shift from 3G to 4G and are likely to play a significant role in the move towards 5G. Huawei installed its first and only factory in Africa in Algiers. The data centers built by both firms in Egypt, Algeria, and other North African countries. And they're involved in the development of artificial intelligence and cloud computing services in the region. So these activities create theoretically important instances of technology spillovers. And this is what I try to analyze during my fieldwork. So this paper draws on 73 semi-structured interviews in Egypt and Algeria, conducted between October 2021 and March 2022, with local and foreign employees at Huawei and ZTE in Algeria and Egypt, ICT policymakers, students receiving training from ZTE and Huawei. And I also included in my sample workers at other Western ICT firms to avoid falling in the trap of Chinese exceptionalism and to kind of contrast what's happening within these Chinese firms and like other foreign firms, you know, because sometimes, as Richard was mentioning, we tend to say that, you know, some of the literature is quick to say that these are Chinese practices, but sometimes they tend to be broader industry practices. So data was collected during and after the fieldwork from financial and business newspapers and companies' annual reports. Quantitative data was also sometimes collected via interviewees. I adopted a theory-driven coding strategy to identify technology transfer using codes of the different mechanisms, so like horizontal spillovers, for instance, and like vertical spillovers. And then I followed a more inductive approach to analyze the power dynamics between different actors and the content conveyed in linkages. So this is a graph of the hypothesized channels of technology transfer in the ICT sector. So it all happens within the big kind of like political economy setting of each of the two countries I'm studying here. So as we can see, like horizontal spillovers, for instance, the digital multinational, the MNC, is supposed to like train and local workers and managers, and then horizontal spillovers would happen through labor mobility towards, you know, local with workers and managers going to local competition or setting up their own ventures, their own startups, and so on. Vertical spillovers are also supposed to take place and were witnessed on the ground through training with the digital MNC training, subcontractors, customers, in this case, mainly telecom operators, and also by providing training and guidance to suppliers. You can notice that the lines for vertical spillovers are thicker than the lines for horizontal spillovers, just because theoretically this channel of technology transfer is supposed to be more powerful. In the digital sector, the linkages between foreign MNCs and universities are also very important. So there's a lot of training that digital multinationals were providing to university students and like providing also ICT certifications. So through my interviews, I was testing basically these different linkages and trying to understand both their like intensity, but also their nature and their quality and their impact on technological upgrading. So we'll start findings. I'm going to start with horizontal spillovers. So one of the findings through interviews that came up through interviews is that there is greater labor localization in North Africa. And this is mainly due to increasing labor costs in China. So Huawei, for instance, at the moment employs about 1,000 workers in Egypt, 500 in Algeria, which is like a smaller market. ZTE has about 200 direct employees, like people on ZTE contracts, but employs more on leased contracts. And for Egypt, an interview with a top manager at ZTE Egypt refused to give me the exact number and said that it was like confidential information. So I don't know exactly the number of Chinese of employees in ZTE's office in Cairo yet. So fieldwork findings suggested the existence of a glass ceiling for local employees, with top managerial positions all filled with Chinese nationals. There was also limited evidence of horizontal spillovers, because most Algerian and Egyptian employees in ICT multinationals would move to other multinationals within the same ecosystem. So an employee at Huawei is more likely to seek employment at Nokia or Ericsson than go work with Mobilis or Jay-Z in Algeria, which are like local ICT firms. And this is mainly due to the big salary gaps. These companies provide very high salaries that local companies fail to match. And so there's very limited instances of horizontal spillovers. In terms of vertical spillovers, interviewed suppliers and subcontractors indicated that Huawei and ZTE provided them with training similarly to other foreign ICT firms. So this is an industry practice. However, there was limited technology transfer, even in activities assumed to be spillover intensive, such as manufacturing. And here, the example of Algiers, Huawei's factory is a case in point. The factory, so Huawei set up this factory after the Algerian government decided to ban the import of mobile phones. And it trained a number of engineers to run the factory and assembly lines. However, interviews revealed that the rate of integration with the local economy was very small. An interviewee even mentioned that phone boxes would be imported from China. So there's very little local supply, very little interactions with the local network, creating very few instances of backward linkages. The production was mainly relying on semi-knocked-off kits, and only the final process of the manufacturing process was actually taking place in Algeria with very little value addition. And so as we're speaking now, I'm currently in Algiers, and the factory was shut down because the Algerian government decided to stop the import of semi-knocked-off kits. And so at the moment, the factory is not operating anymore. And there is negotiation for increasing the rate of technological integration. So training to local firms did not actually convey knowledge that could help local technological upgrading. And so even though there was training, kind of scrutinizing these linkages through the techno-politics framework I'm using shows that most of these training actually served as socio-technical links that would help create an ecosystem of identifiable local firms that are able to fix, troubleshoot, and maintain equipment from Huawei or ZTE. So there is training, and every local firm in the ecosystem I've interviewed reported having regular training with big ICT firms, but these training mainly serve to kind of allow these local firms to fix and understand the functioning of Chinese equipment in this case, and the standards used by Chinese manufacturers. But it wasn't training that was introducing new knowledge that could allow technological upgrading. When it comes to university linkages, so ZTE has several partnerships with universities in Algeria and Egypt. But really, Huawei kind of very much stands out in terms of its activity in the university sector. There's no firm that is as active as Huawei in terms of training students and providing scholarships in both Algeria and Egypt. So Huawei is setting up what it calls its ICT academies, and it aims to train hundreds of local instructors to then train thousands of local students and certify them with Huawei certifications. So most of the literature describes this as, a sign that Huawei and Chinese tech firms in general are contributing to technology transfer. However, when we look at these training and their content and kind of try and analyze their effects at a deeper level through the techno-politics framework, this training stop being kind of these depoliticized nodes, become actually politically charged programs that create winners and losers. And so looking at it, actually, Huawei, through these ICT certifications, is actively competing with Cisco, which has historically dominated the enterprise subsector. And it has provided, fieldwork has showed that Huawei has been cutting costs on these certifications, which usually cost between $200 and $500, and that students have to pay with their own money. It's not covered by universities. And so Huawei, during the COVID pandemic, decided to make all its certifications free. So more and more students started getting certified with Huawei certifications instead of Cisco's. And with this, Huawei is very much creating localized ecosystems of trained engineers, salespeople who have the capacity to understand Huawei's technologies and can install it and sell it. And actually, some of the interviewees said that through time, an engineer working with an Algerian mobile carrier mentioned that, within 5 years of employment, the number of Chinese equipment had significantly increased, because through time, more and more engineers would be more comfortable using Chinese technologies, and they would be, using technologies provided by other providers. So as a conclusion, both ZTE and Huawei have been dynamic actors in Egypt and Algeria, in Algeria's ICT ecosystem. But like the Western competitors, the two Chinese tech firms have kept a tight rein over their intellectual property. And this obviously limits opportunities for technology transfer. Emerging linkages between Chinese firms and the two economies is reconfiguring ecosystems around the use and consumption of Chinese technologies and standards. Linkages are diffusing Chinese hardware, software, and processes that are shaping distinct digital systems. This is not, contributing to technological upgrading. And without proactive policies from host governments, the digital Silk Road risks creating new technological dependencies and locking in local ICT actors in activities and relationships that are captured and defined by Chinese digital giants. I have a set of policy recommendations, but I just selected 3 here because I'm wary of time. One obvious policy recommendation to boost vertical spillovers would be to make consortium bidding between local and foreign firms required. And this would allow local firms to be integrated in some of the big ICT projects, and also introduce requirements on technology transfer to allow local firms to benefit from the presence of these Chinese digital giants, but also other foreign tech firms present in the ecosystem. In terms of horizontal spillovers, a policy that has been used in different countries is actually to try and match the salaries offered by foreign multinationals in at least public ICT companies. This would create more of an incentive for labor mobility towards local ICT firms. And in terms of linkages with universities, I think one shouldn't be naive thinking that this big technological firm would just happily share their advanced knowledge, which is the source of their profits, with local economies. And it's very much important to boost investment in human capital and investing in indigenous research and development capabilities. I'm going to leave it here, and I'm happy to take questions and comments.
Slide. Can everyone see my slide here? Okay, that's good. Let me do this. So good morning, everyone. Greetings from Cape Town. This is Grace Wang, and it is my great honor and pleasure to be presenting my ongoing research today. I want to briefly introduce myself first, though I recognize some similar faces here today. So I did my dissertation on China's Silicon Valley, like how China's Silicon Valley, Shenzhen, has evolved from a fishing village 40 years ago to China's technological hub. So with my previous work and experience, I tried to find out the link between Chinese technology companies and their presence in Africa. So I took a postdoc research fellow position as a South African National Research Foundation grant holder. So why do I come to Africa? So first of all, I want to provide you with an overall research background to let you know why study and examine Africa and China's tech expansion in this continent is very important. So first of all, is the rising importance of the African continent, especially pre-COVID. So Africa actually has experienced a tremendous economic growth over the past few decades, and at the same time, the health of Africans has also improved, which actually contributed to a very productive workforce that could support the local economy. Second is, along with Africa's economic development is demographic change and urbanization. So over 50% of the African population will be residing in 7 countries by 2030. So urbanization and the resulting high proportion of city residents actually represent an increase in the potential skilled labor and also consumer base with relatively better consumption power, which could further lead to economic opportunities that attract both local and international investors. Third is in recent years, African governments have been trying to improve this business environment. So overall, right now, Africa has a relatively friendly business environment, so which also attract the international investors. And last but not least, since we're talking about digital economy and digital development today, so Sub-Saharan Africa is actually the largest and the fastest growing market in ICT all over the world. So that is some background of why Africa is important and why I want to examine China's digital expansion in Africa. So Africa continent is, of course, located in the global south. So that's why I approach this study using South-to-South cooperation. And South-to-South cooperation, as you can see from the slide, it refers to the technical cooperation among developing countries in the global south. And the analyzing actors usually include the southern states, the international organizations, academics, civil society, and the private sector. So the often collaborative areas include agriculture development, human rights, urbanization, health, and climate change. So if you are not that familiar with South-to-South cooperation, here's a little bit historical background. So developing countries at that time tried to seek ways to chart the course of the development. And I think to some extent, it is very similar to our current geopolitical environment. So right now, many countries in the global south are trying to find new ways to achieve developmental goals, especially during the post-COVID period. You probably know, since I'm in South Africa and native of China, and we know the BRICS Bank, which is called the New Development Bank, headquartered in Shanghai. So there are more and more countries from the global south are waiting to join the BRICS membership, and in order to get loans and financial aid from the New Development Bank. So that is the importance of the South-to-South cooperation. And some key characteristics of South-to-South cooperation. So first of all, as I mentioned, the participants. So most developing countries located in the south of the planet. And this is also back in the 1970s. So this is the first framework for the southern states cooperation and the principles of a relationship between the southern states. So the South-to-South cooperation as my analytical framework, it is of a great importance. First of all, the countries of the South in the past few decades have contributed to the world's growth tremendously. And second, in terms of that kind of economic growth, the intra-South trade accounts for more than a quarter of the all world trade now. And third, the outflows of a foreign direct investment from the South represent a third of the global flows. So the foreign direct investment no longer is only from the global North to the global South. So right now there's an increasing trend of the foreign direct investment from the South. And then the last one is the remittance from the migrant workers. Especially in the past, a lot of, migrants to the United States, they send the remittance to back to China, especially in the early 80s. That actually helped with China's financial networks at the very early age. So this is the importance of a South-to-South cooperation. And in terms of a South-to-South cooperation in development, it is a very valuable complement to the North and South development. As some presenters have already have been working on about like a technological transfer or knowledge sharing. So there are three key elements of the South-to-South cooperation development, which is knowledge sharing, technical assistance, and the financial aid. So I actually add political dialogue in the center of the triangle because I argue that no matter what kind of cooperation in terms of knowledge sharing, technical assistance, or financial aid, it is important to have friendly, effective political dialogue among the southern states. So there are some, successful southern states examples. This is what I listed. Because of the time issue, I'm not going to elaborate on that. So what I want to emphasize is South-to-South cooperation also faced a lot of challenges in development. So first of all is the quality of information. For instance, the data, processes, cases, and change agents, right? Sometimes, a lot of institutions in the African states lack transparency, so that adds a lot of challenges and difficulties to South-to-South cooperation. And the second is the reinforced results orientation, like the previous presenter Tin said, right? So it seems like a lot of ICT training is going on in a lot of African countries by Chinese tech firms, but what is the result? So we have to emphasize more on the results orientation, and then it is better aligned to national systems and development. So that is the general background of a South-to-South cooperation. So under the South-to-South cooperation, in 2019, actually, the Technological Transfer South-to-South Cooperation Center is officially established with the approval of Ministry of Science and Technology in Beijing and the United Nations Development Program. So under the technological transfer South-to-South cooperation, there's several aims. The first of all is a technological transfer platform and database. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of discussion here today. And second is the sustainable development technology. So I argue that the green technology plays a very important role in this kind of South-to-South technological collaboration. And third is a new type high-end think tank on South-to-South cooperation. So in order to facilitate technical assistance and knowledge sharing, we have to facilitate the think tank and knowledge exchange. Fourth is one of the aim is to apply China's best practice and experience to overcome common challenges for technology cooperation under the global governance. I'm going to elaborate on that with my example later on. And then how to develop and promote advanced and applicable technologies is also very important as an aim, and also share experiences in innovation-driven development. So I think this is very important. I want to highlight that because this is the innovation-driven development. It does not only say this is a technology transfer or this is a technical assistance. So the emphasis is more on development rather than innovation. And then last but not least, it is very important to increase the capacity building and the developing countries assistance programs under this technological center framework. So there's some current development of South-to-South technological collaboration. Like I just mentioned, I think we need to expand the definition of technological collaboration. So first of all, I want to give you an example of the China-South Africa agriculture cooperation in technology. So first, since it started in 2011, there's some joint research between China and South Africa on maize planting and cultivation techniques. Also joint research on animal breeding techniques, the farming, waste sieving, irrigation techniques, and the agriculture technology on a bilateral basis. Because I have been in South Africa for almost a year, and there's a huge need for agriculture technology to improve the poverty and to solve the famine issues in Africa. And then if we go a little bit further, if we talk about the digital technology, I actually in my work classify Chinese technologies into three categories. The first one is technological telecommunications and infrastructure focused, for instance, ZTE and Huawei. The second one is consumer electronic products such as Xiaomi, Oppo, which is, like electronic smartphones. And the third one is internet platforms, for instance, like Tencent, TikTok. So here are some other people's classification of China's top digital companies. Then they classify like a Huawei, ZTE, like a digital economy, innovative enterprises. And some people classify Xiaomi like kind of a Chinese innovative software enterprises, and the Chinese internet platform like Tencent, Alibaba, TikTok. So here I want to show you in terms of the consumer products, and there's some mix between the telecommunication infrastructure companies with the consumer electronic products, for instance, as we know, Huawei. So this is a market share of Huawei's mobile devices in South Africa. So this is in 2019. So Huawei smartphone accounted for 46.08 in the South African mobile devices market. And then the next Chinese consumer company is Xiaomi, which at that time accounts for 0.76. And then in 2022, which is very recent, so the share of Huawei's percentage in the South Africa's mobile devices has been increased. So does Xiaomi. So this is like the pictures of the mobile devices company, and also the mix of the telecommunication company and the infrastructure company. So there are a variety of Chinese tech presence in Africa, like I just mentioned, like 3 categories. So in terms of the ICT training, this is a popular press I wrote for the China Global South Project. So when it comes to ICT training, Africa differs from the Western critiques on Huawei. As the previous presenter presented on Huawei's technology and training, I actually did a very thorough case study in my dissertation last year. I finished last year on Huawei. So there is a certificate in China under Huawei. This is a Huawei ICT certificate. And at the same time, Huawei expanded its ICT certificate in China into a global corporate program called Seeds for the Future. So there are actually a lot of ICT training programs under the Seeds for the Future in a lot of African states. And in this year alone, Nigeria actually signed a 3-year contract with Huawei for its country's technical labor force training. So if you are interested, I will share this article I wrote. So this is an example to show the ICT infrastructure development collaboration. So Huawei technology contribute to the Angola's wireless technology and generation networks, and also help Angola build a telecom technical training center with the involvement of the state government. And that is the infrastructure and telecommunications technology company. And then the next one is the internet company, which is the TikTok. So this is an example, a Nigeria guy who led the TikTok into the Africa, and now is building up his own fintech startup. So TikTok actually made huge waves when it started to sponsor the African Cup of Nations. So I'm going to summarize at the very end about like how Chinese tech companies' involvement in Africa differ from the American ones. So now I'm talking about the American ones. So there is not only the Chinese presence in Africa, and also the American ones. So on the top of the picture, you see actually Facebook's CEO, Mark Zuckerberg. So in 2016, Mark Zuckerberg visited Nigeria and talking about to expand the Facebook market in Africa and building the foundations and the incubators to help the entrepreneurs in Africa. And next, the Hack Lab Foundation is actually an incubator and a nonprofit organization located in Ghana to help train entrepreneurs and help to the investment, startup investment. So in this picture, this is also the fintech company from UK. It is on the left, and this is on the right. Is about the medical technology company. So this is the the American and the Western companies' influences in Africa, as I listed here, Facebook actually opened its first headquarters in Johannesburg in 2015. Amazon opened its first Amazon office in Johannesburg, and it is trying to build this data center in Cape Town recently. And Microsoft also launched its first African Development Center in 2019. And as we all know, Microsoft has a big presence on Microsoft Research in Africa as well. And Google last year in 2019 opened its first artificial lab in Africa as well. So this is some presence of American technology companies. And in addition to that, we all know the very famous incubator, which is the Y Combinator. So Y Combinator has been investing in the startups in Africa very, very tremendously. So this is the breakdown of the recent Y Combinator's investment, which is rare for Chinese companies. So which is I'm going to conclude. So this is like an American entrepreneur and investor would say when they look like the Africa, they do not only see this continent as a market, but also a source of innovation and a talent, which differs from a lot of Chinese companies that says Africa as a huge market, but at the same time, only Huawei is developing the ICT training for the African states. So my conclusion is, since this is ongoing research, my conclusion is that China's digital expansion in Africa is a South-to-South cooperation or South-to-South or South dominance. So obviously, it is not China's technological South dominance. So there are some differences. So far, I think China's tech in Africa differs from American techs in Africa, as you can see. So Chinese technology companies, no matter it's state-owned or private companies, focus more on infrastructure building. And there are a lot of government incentives. So even though Huawei is a private company and Huawei's a lot of initiatives in Africa and South Africa are supported, at least supported on the surface level by the government. And the Chinese companies focus more on public sector and the government-driven collaborations. And there's a lack of firm level learning. So there's a lack of a firm-to-firm collaboration and learning. And which means there's a lack of localization among a lot of Chinese tech firms. And there is some difference between technical assistance initiatives from technological collaboration, because technological collaboration is more based on the mutual benefit, but technical assistance is more from Chinese tech companies are helping the companies or helping the universities in the African states. And also for a lot of Chinese technology companies, there's a lack of effective media narratives. So especially in some democratic states in Africa, that differs from their welcoming attitudes of Chinese technology companies in the authoritarian states. So I think this is because of the Chinese technology companies' branding problem. And last but not least, there's a lack of capacity building and scientific training in universities and research centers of excellence for a lot of Chinese tech companies in Africa. So on the other side, American tech in Africa is more investment focused, like I mentioned, the Y Combinator's example. And American technology companies' startup model, there's more focused on startup model transfer based on the successful Silicon Valley model, which Shenzhen, the China Silicon Valley, actually has already learned a lot from Silicon Valley model. For instance, the co-working space, the incubator, accelerator, that is because of the strong venture capitalism presence in America. And then for a lot of American tech, as I mentioned, the foundation, they more focus on the talent, but the talent is, they have a preference because in the Y Combinator picture, you see they founded a lot of female founders. So that's kind of like American public diplomacy compared to the Chinese technology companies. And then based on that, that also means American tech companies focus more on the social fabric, focus more on the culture, which is the soft power. And then a lot of American tech companies focus their foundations through local partnership. This is a huge lack of the presence for a lot of Chinese tech companies in Africa. And there are a lot of actually firm level collaborations in American tech instead of the government initiative for a lot of Chinese tech companies. So this is my conclusion of my research so far. And if you have any questions, this is ongoing. I welcome any comments and questions. And if you want to get in touch, this is my contact information. And last but not least, I actually run a media platform. So recently, I just started this called Tech in Africa. So if you're interested, I'm happy to talk more with you. Thank you.